So tonight's session is about how to sleep well, and it's looking at all aspects of sleep and what we can do to improve our sleep. And I know personally that that's a tricky subject because for me, my mast cell activation syndrome particularly manifests in me not being able to sleep. And I know that that's the case for a lot of people, that we do tend to struggle a bit. And so we're going to look at some general tips and helpful things that we can do that can promote better sleep. So just a quick introduction to me. I know many of you know me and have been to my talks before, but I'm a naturopathic health coach, and I also do mindfulness and psychotherapy and eye movement therapy. But I particularly come at this with my own lived experience because I live with MCAS and Lyme and dysautonomia and chronic pain. So I kind of put those two aspects together, my professional training and qualifications, but also my lived experience. And a lot of this really is based on my lived experience and things that have helped me and things that I've learned on my journey. So tonight we're going to look at what is sleep, how do we sleep, what happens when we're asleep. We're going to touch briefly on why sleep is important for us and why we should work to improve it and value our sleep. And then we'll look at some of the things that can interfere with our sleep and prevent us from sleeping well, and some tips that help us to improve our sleep. So first of all, what is sleep? It isn't just resting. There's actually a lot of active biological processes happening in our brains and our bodies when we're asleep. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important to get good quality sleep, or as good sleep as we can manage, because it's so important for our well-being. And, it's critical to a healthy, well-balanced body. So what is optimal sleep? So generally speaking, researchers seem to think that between 7 and 9 hours is considered optimal for adults, and less than 7 hours is what medically is considered to be poor sleep. But the amount of sleep that we need is individual. It varies from person to person. So if you're looking at that and thinking, oh, panic, not necessarily. It may be that for you, you are one of the people that need less sleep and you can function with that. And it does vary depending on our age as well. So people who are around 65 and over, they tend to get 7 hours. For adults, it's 7 to 9, as I said. Teenagers, 8 to 10, children 9 to 12, and babies need 14 to 17 hours of sleep. So it varies and changes as we go through our life. And timing of sleep is very important because, it's not just the length of time that we sleep, it's how well we sleep within that. So if we're waking up a lot, if we have a lot of broken sleep, that affects us. And also the timing of sleep. So if we are looking at when we go to bed, there are certain factors in our body that work better, or activities that happen before midnight. So it's good to try and get some sleep a couple of hours maybe before midnight for our body to do those processes, and particularly our brain detoxes. Between the hours of 10 and 2, we have more delta sleep. So that's the really deep phase of sleep. And our bodies naturally tend to do that between 10 and 2. So obviously, if we're not going to bed until midnight or 1 o'clock, then that means our delta sleep, that deep restorative sleep, less of that is happening, because after 2 o'clock, our body then switches more into REM sleep, this rapid eye movement sleep. And interestingly, we'll see as we go along that our brain does a detox process when we're in delta sleep. So we need more delta sleep for our brains to be healthy and functional. So we need to go to bed in good time to get plenty of those delta episodes of sleep. And some studies suggest that around 10 p.m. is the kind of optimal time to go to bed. As I say, it varies. Some people are night owls and other people, need to go to bed earlier than that. But generally speaking, around 10 is a good time to go to sleep. So the way that we sleep is not just one block of continuous sleep. We go through various cycles in our sleep, and each cycle lasts for around 90 minutes. And within each 90 minutes, we will go through each of these stages in sleep. So light sleep is that kind of what we might consider drowsy or dozy. It's kind of transitioning between wakefulness and sleep, and the body starts to relax and our brain waves start to slow down a little bit. And then we go into stage 2, which is still light sleep, but deeper. And so our heart rate drop and our breathing drops and our body temperature drops. And we're in that stage of sleep for about 50% of the total amount of sleep. And then we get into these episodes of delta sleep, which is where our brain waves really slow right down and we get into what's known as deep sleep or slow wave sleep. And this is the really restorative phase of sleep. This is where all the repair work and the cellular regeneration is happening, and our body builds bone and muscle in that time, and our immune system is working, and our brain is doing this detoxing. So we want to get that deep sleep. Ideally, we want to get plenty of these episodes of delta sleep. And then after we've been in delta, we then move into REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which we're quite often familiar with because it's the part of sleep where we dream, and you can see people's eyelids flickering. And if you've got pets and you see them twitching and running in their sleep, that they're in REM, they're dreaming, and they've got that rapid eye movement. And REM sleep has a different function to delta sleep. So we need both aspects, because when we're in REM sleep, studies show that it helps us to consolidate learning and memory, and that's when we process things that have happened to us during the day and consolidate those into memory, and also helps us to process difficult emotions. So dreaming helps us to get rid of kind of unused, unspent impulses that we've had in our nervous system during the day, like maybe a shock or a stress. Our body then processes that and completes the cycle, so we're not holding that in our bodies. So REM sleep is really helpful and really useful, and it's considered to be good for problem solving and creativity, and also helps us, as I say, with our emotional regulation. And people who don't have REM sleep, they lack REM sleep and they lack dream sleep, they tend to have, emotional and mental health issues because of that. So we need to go through all of these different cycles within our sleep. And as I say, each 90-minute cycle, we will cycle through that light sleep, stage 2, stage 3, and then REM sleep. And then the next 90 minutes, we'll go through those again. So we repeat around between 4 to 6 90-minute cycles per night. So that is, depending on how long we sleep for, we need to get in between 4 and 6 of those 90-minute cycles. And those stages, as I said, we tend to do longer delta phases between 10 and 2. And then after 2, we do smaller delta phases and longer REM phases. So the body is making sure that we have all of our functions that need to happen. It's fitting them all in during different times of the night. And we cycle through those processes. So it's important to think when you go to bed, have you got enough time before you set your alarm in the morning? Can you do 4, 5, or 6 90-minute cycles? Because the reason I say that is if your alarm goes off and you're in the middle of one of those 90-minute cycles, that's when we tend to wake up feeling pretty rubbish and groggy and foggy. So we need to make sure that we'll have finished our last 90-minute cycle before the alarm goes off, and try and time it, when you go to bed and when you wake up, when you set your alarm. Make sure you've got time for those 90-minute cycles. So I'm going to look now at why sleep is important and how sleep affects our health. And this is interesting, and there's lots of interesting studies out there about sleep and health now, and we're understanding much more about how poor sleep affects our health. But I just want to preface this bit by saying that as somebody who struggles with their sleep, and I know that many of us do with MCAS, it's important not to get too caught up with this. It's important to understand why sleep is important and good for us, and it's important to to value our sleep and to put a high value on it and not think, oh, well, it doesn't matter. I won't try. I won't, bother about that, because it does affect us. But worrying about this, just is counterproductive, and it makes it worse. And as someone, myself, who struggles with sleep, as I say, I am obviously aware of all of this research that says how important sleep is, but I don't let that prey on my mind. I don't let it bother me, because it is just research. And just because the research says, it might impact this or it might impact that, it doesn't mean that that's going to happen to us. It doesn't mean that that's, going to happen to us. But it's just good to have that awareness of what sleep is doing for our bodies. So there are three areas really that sleep affects, and cognitive impairment. Obviously, when we all know when we haven't had enough sleep, we can't think properly, and our memory is not so good, and we're not so good at making decisions, because that kind of executive functioning bit is a bit dozy and groggy. It also has an impact on our mood and our mental health. As I've suggested, we need sleep in order to keep ourselves mentally well, and there are correlations between depression, anxiety, irritability, and our mood. And it also affects our physical health. So when we don't sleep very well, studies show that it's correlated potentially with high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. Obesity and weight gain is very highly linked to not sleeping well. And also our immune response is very affected by our sleep. So I'm just going to look at those a little bit more. So obesity, really, our sleep is very connected to the hormones that control our appetite and our satiety, ghrelin and leptin. So ghrelin tells us that we're hungry, and leptin tells us that we're full. And when we don't sleep well, when we have less than 7 hours of sleep, those hormone signaling pathways are affected. So we tend to feel more hungry and have a bigger appetite, and we don't get the signals that we're full. So there's a correlation between weight gain and poor sleep. And also diabetes. When we don't sleep well, it affects the way insulin works in our bodies and how sensitive we are to insulin. So people who have type 2 diabetes are, that can be impacted by sleep. As I mentioned, heart health, our levels of inflammation generally, and, our blood pressure is affected. Pain, we know that there's a massive bidirectional relationship between pain and sleep. So if we're not sleeping well, we all know if we've had a poor night's sleep, our pain is worse the next day. But also, if we're in pain, it impacts our sleep and we don't sleep so well. So there's that direct correlation. Obviously, fatigue, but not just the fatigue that we know about when we feel a bit tired, but actually cellular fatigue. Our bodies need sleep in order to do that lovely repair and regeneration, and for our mitochondria that produce energy to work properly. So we need sleep for energy production and also immunity. If we're not sleeping well, our immune cells are not reproducing well. We don't produce as much antibodies. For example, studies have shown that people who were sleep deprived didn't produce antibodies as well after a vaccine. So we're more likely to be susceptible to colds and bugs and things like that. And then there's brain health. So we've talked about memory and learning, that cognitive function. We don't consolidate those memories, so we get forgetful. We don't have maybe problem solving and decision making abilities. They become a bit affected. And also our creativity, that REM aspect of sleep affects our creativity if we're not getting that. And as I mentioned before, this brain cleansing, which is really important. When we're in delta sleep, something called the glymphatic drainage is happening in our brains, where the toxic byproducts, the metabolites of our brain functioning, and any toxins and anything that is in our brains that is, not necessary and shouldn't be there anymore. The brain washes itself out every night when we're in delta sleep, and those toxins are flushed out into our lymphatic drainage system so they can be eliminated from the body. So if we have consistently, night after night after night, prolonged exposure to not very much or not enough delta sleep, that can lead to the buildup of these toxins and byproducts in our brain. And we obviously don't want that, so it's important to think about delta sleep and prioritizing that. And then we mentioned how sleep and mental health are so closely correlated. So there are links with depression and with anxiety because we over respond to perceived stress and threat when we're lacking in sleep. So we can feel anxious, and sleep disturbances dysregulates our neurotransmitters. So the balance of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine in our brain can be altered. And obviously, if we're lacking in serotonin, we're going to be, feeling low in mood. And we all know that when we've not had a lot of sleep, we lose our joy, and that get up and go that makes us feel motivated and gives us energy. We just lose our ability to respond to positive things and feel positive emotions if we're experiencing long-term insomnia. So these are reasons why we need to think about our sleep and make sure that we prioritize it and that we really value our sleep and do whatever we can to help ourselves to improve our sleep. So now we're going to look at some of the things that stop us sleeping and that can interfere with our ability to get a good night's sleep. So stress. Stress is obviously very highly linked to insomnia because when we're feeling stressed, we're producing cortisol, and cortisol has all sorts of disruptive effects on our sleep cycle. It prevents us, from being able to sleep. It interferes with our body systems and our hormones that make us sleepy, and they get blocked by cortisol. So we don't want to be feeling stressed, and we don't want high levels of cortisol. Anxiety for the same reason, when we feel anxious, it disrupts our ability to relax and to calm down and to rest and go into that restful state. Pain, as we've mentioned, pain disrupts our sleep and stops us from being able to get good sleep. It wakes us in the night sometimes and causes broken sleep. Blue light exposure, there's a lot of talk now about, awareness about the fact that watching television, looking at computer screens and looking at our phone screens, we can't really see it, but that light is in the blue spectrum, and our brain perceives blue light as being daylight, and so it thinks it's daytime, so it doesn't produce the chemicals and the hormones that we need to go to sleep. It thinks that it's daytime. And then that really disrupts our circadian rhythm because our brain can't tell when it's nighttime and when it's daytime because we're exposed to this blue daytime light all of the time. So in the evenings before we go to bed, if we're exposed to blue light, it can disrupt our sleep. Erratic blood sugar. So if we're not eating well during the day and we're not giving our body a steady supply of glucose through things like eating complex carbohydrates and good fats and good proteins, then our blood sugar can drop during the night. And if our blood sugar drops too low, the body releases cortisol to convert some of the sugar that's stored in our liver into the usable form of sugar to get our blood sugar levels back up again. So we're releasing cortisol there in the night. And as we've seen, we don't want cortisol because cortisol wakes us up and disrupts our sleep. So if our blood sugar, if we go to bed and we haven't got enough fuel in the tank to last us all night and our blood sugar tanks during the night, we're going to get cortisol. And that can happen repeatedly during the night. And every time we release cortisol, it can be released before the last lot has got out of our system. So we then get more and more and more cortisol building up in our system, which then leads to more disrupted sleep. If we eat too late in the evening, our digestion is a very active process in the body. We kind of stuff it into our mouths and then forget about it and think that the job is done. But actually, our body is very, very busy once we've eaten, and our digestive processes happening in the night are very disruptive to our body sleeping. And also, they're very costly in terms of energy. So the body is then very busy digesting, and it doesn't have any energy spare to do all these other functions that we've talked about that are supposed to be happening when we're asleep, because we're still too busy doing the daytime functions of digesting. So that can disturb our sleep and wake us because our digestive system is busy and active if we're eating too late. So light in the bedroom. So any source of light, even if it's like, the light on an electrical gadget that has, an on light maybe, anything that's giving off a bit of light affects our melatonin production, because melatonin is only produced in complete darkness. And melatonin is this lovely hormone that controls our circadian rhythm really, and tells us that it's time to go to sleep. And we only produce that in complete darkness. So this is very correlated again to the blue light exposure as well. So the blue light and lights in the bedroom, they will be messing with our production of melatonin, which then affects our ability to go to sleep. Muscle tension, we need to relax in order to go to sleep. That's a fundamental part of sleeping. So if we've got tension in our muscles, we have pain, and we also have signals being sent to our body and to our brain that maybe we're not safe, we're in a state of stress, and the body doesn't want to relax then. It doesn't think it's safe to go to sleep. So we need to try and work on reducing our muscle tension. And also lack of exercise. If we're struggling to exercise, which I know many of us do, we struggle when we're poorly to do a lot of movement during the day. And if we do that, it disrupts our sleep, because when we exercise, it tires the body out, and it gives the body the signal that we have done a lot of work, and so now it's time to go to sleep at night. So when we don't exercise, it affects our ability to go to sleep. Dietary deficiencies. So there's been a really large study that shows that deficiencies in certain nutrients, and the one in this study was calcium, magnesium, and vitamins A, C, D, E, and K, were all associated with sleep problems. So if we're deficient in nutrients, it affects our sleep. Our bodies need these nutrients in order to be able to do the functions that it needs to do while we're asleep, and it affects our sleep. Stimulants, we all know about things like alcohol and caffeine. They stimulate our nervous system, they stimulate our brain, but also spices and nicotine in cigarettes, they act in the same way. So they block the receptors for our sleep hormones in our brains, and they stimulate our nervous system, and they mess with our ability to go to sleep. Neurotransmitter imbalances. So we have various different neurotransmitters, and there are certain neurotransmitters that are essential for us to go to sleep. So some of those are GABA, which is a very calming hormone, calming neurotransmitter that causes our body to relax, our nervous system to relax. And obviously that's what we need when we go to sleep. L-theanine, again, as well, very calming for the nervous system, and serotonin. So these neurotransmitters promote sleep. And if we haven't got enough of those, then our sleep can be affected. Similarly, overstimulation. If we're doing something that keeps our brain very busy, it's our brain and our nervous system that needs to relax and calm in order for us to go to sleep. And if just before bed we're doing our tax return, or watching something really frightening on the television, or reading a horror book, anything that's putting, even you might not be aware of the fact that you're stressed, but your nervous system is actually receiving that as a stress signal, as a stimulating signal. So anything like that kind of gears us up, we then can get into bed and find that our nervous system is just too wired and we can't get to sleep. And then going back to the neurotransmitters, histamine, I added this one in for us particularly because obviously histamine is a big factor for those of us that live with MCAS. And histamine is actually a very powerful neurotransmitter, and it's one of the stimulating neurotransmitters. It's excitatory to the brain and the nervous system. So when we have too much histamine in our system, particularly in our brains and our nervous system, this is where the neurotransmitter imbalance can happen, because we end up with too much of the stimulating signals and not enough of the calming and relaxing signals. And histamine and GABA are kind of on a seesaw. So when we have very high levels of histamine, our GABA levels tend to go down. And as I say, GABA is this lovely calming substance that helps us to sleep. And so we then get that imbalance and we find that we can't sleep. Whereas if we can increase GABA and histamine goes down, that can help us to sleep again. So it's making sure that we get that balance in our neurotransmitters, and working on lowering our histamine levels is, really key to helping us to sleep with MCAS. It's all about how you can get histamine levels down. And many of us find that antihistamines do help us with sleep, and the medications that we're being prescribed, once you get on the right medication that is helping you with your histamine levels, it massively improves sleep. Because we all know years ago there used to be the antihistamines used to make you drowsy because they crossed the blood-brain barrier, they blocked the histamine receptors in the brain, and that made you go to sleep. So that's why histamine, affects our sleep so much. And so when we are looking at antihistamines, and if we're struggling with sleep, the ones that cross the blood-brain barrier can be really helpful for us because they do block the histamine in the brain and the nervous system. And that's what we really need if we're going to be, affecting our sleep and helping ourselves with insomnia. And then I'm going to look now at ways in which we can improve our sleep, tips that can help us to sleep better. So we talk about sleep hygiene, and this is the idea that our circadian rhythms need a certain pattern in order for our body to work. It's all working on a clock internally, our whole body systems, including our mast cells and our immune system. That is very, very closely tied to our circadian rhythm, particularly our mast cells. So when our circadian rhythm is all out of whack and we're not in that nice balanced rhythmic state, our mast cells can be really impacted by that. So this idea of sleep hygiene is to get ourselves back into our circadian rhythm. And it's not something that is done, overnight. No pun intended. It's not something that happens easily and quickly. It's something that needs consistent practice because our body comes into alignment very gradually from the signals that we're sending it. So some of the ways that we can do this are maintaining consistent bedtime and morning routines. So going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time. If we do that consistently, our body eventually gets the message that this is the time to wake up and this is the time to go to sleep. And we are regulating that internal clock. Creating a routine at bedtime that tells our brain this is time to go to sleep. So in the hour or so before bedtime, we need to be doing activities that switch our body into a sleep state of mind. So calming activities like a little bit of reading, something gentle and relaxing, some meditation practice, some mindfulness practice, maybe a little bit of gentle stretching, like a little bit of yoga, and avoiding all of those stimulating things like, gaming and watching television and, using our phones, those kind of things that stimulate our brains. And we may not realize that scrolling on our phone on Facebook, we think maybe it's relaxing, but actually it's still stimulation. It's still incoming signals into our brain and our nervous system that our body is very interested in, and it doesn't help us to come down and to settle. So we need to start creating whatever works for you. This is really individualized and really personal, is finding your own routine just before bed. What do you do that helps you to settle? Your sleep environment is really, really important because our nervous system has to feel safe. In order for us to be able to go to sleep, subconsciously, we have to have a signal that we are safe. And that is the fundamental bedrock on which sleep is created. So the environment in which we sleep should feel nurturing and comforting and safe. So keeping your bedroom really cool and dark and quiet and free from distractions and free from stimulation, and free from anything that you associate with stress. This is why it's not great to have your desk, your workspace in your bedroom with you, because your brain, even though you think you've switched the computer off, your brain is still there. It's still in your line of sight, and it's still signaling to your nervous system. And cool, because when our body temperature drops a little bit when we go to sleep, if our body temperature drops by 1 degree, and that's the signal to our body to sleep. So if we can kind of artificially lower our body temperature by 1 degree, it helps to send that signal to our brain that this is time to go to sleep. And then, blackout curtains to make sure it's dark, earplugs, white noise, anything that you can use. And so everyone is different in this respect, but whatever you can do to make that space feel as safe and as relaxing as possible for you. And again, we've talked about limiting that screen time before bed, because it really does disrupt our melatonin production, and we need that melatonin in order to tell us to go to sleep. So we need to switch off electronic devices at least half an hour, ideally an hour, before we want to go to sleep, to give our brains time to get rid of the blue light and to absorb the darkness and the evening light that we're in. So having a bath, again, it's connected to that temperature drop, because obviously when we're in the bath, we get hot, and then we get out of the bath and we feel shivery and cool, and our temperature drops. So that again signals to our bodies and our brains that we need to go to sleep. And this study showed that a hot bath 90 minutes before bed improved the amount of that lovely delta sleep that is so important for our well-being. And something else that you can think about is adding Epsom salts to that bath, because they contain magnesium. And magnesium is the mineral that helps us to relax. It relaxes our muscles. So again, if muscle cramp and muscle spasm is an issue for you, magnesium is going to help with that. But also, magnesium helps our nervous system to relax. Our nervous system needs magnesium in order to be able to relax and go to sleep. So I would say that for those of us who are sensitive and have MCAS, a whole bath of Epsom salts can be too much, because it does have a detoxing effect as well, and it can make us feel worse. So this is one to experiment with, and I wouldn't go straight into a whole body bath. For us, I would say a foot bath to start with, washing up bowl with your feet in front of the, I was going to say in front of the telly, not in front of the telly, in the evening whilst you're relaxing and reading. Put your feet in a foot bath with a bit of Epsom salt, and again, really tiny amounts of Epsom salt. This is like, we approach everything with MCAS really gently, really gradually. So you want like a quarter of a teaspoon to start with. Just test that you're all right with that, and your body is going to be okay with that. If it is, you can build up slowly, and if you can get like, half a cup, that's brilliant. But start slowly, because we can react quite powerfully to this. And I've had people that I've suggested do this, and they've felt quite poorly with MCAS, and I did as well. Before I realized I had MCAS, I thought, well, I always used to get better, feel better if I had a bath with salt in. So I did, and I felt terrible. So please take this one really gently, but in theory, if you can tolerate it, if you can build up gradually. And the thing is here, don't discount it. If you do feel a bit poorly, build up gradually, bit less salt, bit less time, even if you do it for 5 minutes to begin with, build up slowly to it, because it does have benefits, but make sure you go really slowly. Exercising during the day, and I'm not talking about, hitting the gym here and going for the burn. We just need to do a little bit of movement, just a tiny bit more movement. If you can manage, 1 minute of walking is beneficial, 5 minutes of walking, or a little bit of chair yoga or Pilates, Marcel Action. We do some brilliant sessions of Qigong and Pilates that are very, very gentle, but it's just a little bit of movement, and it helps with our bodies to increase, our ability to sleep. So there's one study there that regular exercise reduced the time taken to fall asleep by 55% and increased the total time that people were asleep by 18%. So, evidence there that moving, a little bit of movement during the day can help. But the caveat to that is not before bed. So we don't want to be doing any vigorous exercise, certainly no kind of, gym or, anything that's stimulating with 2 to 3 hours before bed, because it releases cortisol again. When we exercise, it's a stress state in the body and it releases that cortisol. So it will mess with your sleep if you're exercising just before bed. But gentle movement can be really helpful. So it might be that part of your wind down routine would be a little bit of that qigong, very gentle movement, or yoga practices. If you know a little bit of yoga, or you can, go on YouTube, there are some really good restorative yoga practices there. Again, you don't want to be doing the really hardcore yoga. This is not handstands and headstands and things like that. This is just gentle stretching, just to release the tension out of your muscles and to just promote a little bit of movement in your system that helps you to relax before bed. So resetting our body clock, getting morning sunlight is really important. Within the first hour of waking up, you want to get outside and get between 15 and 30 minutes of sunlight into your eyes. So obviously not looking directly at the sun, but just being in daylight and getting light into your body sends the signal into your brain that this is morning, and it tells the body where it is, because otherwise it's just lost in this kind of constant artificial light. It doesn't know when is daytime, which is nighttime. So when we get out in the daylight in the morning, first thing when we wake up, it tells our brain that this is daylight. And sunlight helps to regulate that melatonin production. So studies show that when we get daylight in the morning, we produce more melatonin that night. So it's, it has that effect on our melatonin production at bedtime. Again, consistent bedtime routines, so having that routine. Red and orange light in the evening. So, you want to make sure that you don't want the blue light, but we want sort of warm tones of light in the evening, yellows and oranges, because our brain associates that with firelight and it understands that this means it's dark, and then it knows that it's nighttime. So things like salt lamps are really helpful for, promoting that kind of orange glow, or just low levels of yellow light. But remembering that melatonin is only produced in complete darkness. So when it's bedtime and we want to sleep, it should be completely dark. And as I said, this is a patient's job, resetting our circadian rhythm and sticking to a strict body clock kind of routine really helps to stabilize our mast cells and our general body functions at a cellular level. Everything in our body, from our mitochondria that's producing energy, to our immune system, to our digestive system, everything is working on this clock, and it's in sync with each other because it knows what time. Every part of our body knows what the time is. But if once we get out of sync, we get very dysregulated, and different parts of our bodies, are doing different things at different times. And so it takes time to bring that all back into alignment. But maintaining this consistent routine is one of the most helpful things that we can do when we have MCAS, because it really does help with our mast cells. So reducing stress levels, I've mentioned before about the correlation between stress and sleep and the need for our nervous system to feel safe. We have to feel safe in order to be able to relax, because our subconscious mind just won't allow us to relax and go to sleep if it perceives any kind of stress. So if we've got anxiety and trauma, or stressful things have happened, or things are playing on our minds, it upregulates those, stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, and we get too much of that and not enough of those nice sleepy neurotransmitters like serotonin and GABA. So in our wind down time, some of the activities that can help to regulate our nervous system. Mindfulness is a really lovely one, and meditation practices. Either of those are really useful. Breathing exercises. So thinking about regulating our breathing and doing something that is conscious breathing. So maybe box breathing, breathing in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. That's a really nice practice. And again, it's very regulating for the body. The body is getting signals there of regularity and balance and safety. And if we do a few rounds of that, that can help our bodies to settle and relax. And just, if you're struggling to sleep, focusing on your breathing for a little while. Obviously, I realize that for some of us, when we're having MCAS reactions, our breath and our breathing is uncomfortable. So if that's a problem for you and you struggle with respiratory issues, maybe the breathing stuff is not, your thing. But for those of you who can, just focusing on the rise and fall of your breath and just watching that and just noticing your body breathing, that can be very helpful in allowing the body to sleep. Getting out into nature and walking, there's all sorts of really good chemicals that we get in nature. It's very balancing, it's very calming for our nervous system. We're getting that daylight. So it's all good for helping to regulate the body. Spending time with friends, a phone call with a friend, spending time with people that make you feel good and uplift you, that all switches us into that kind of rest state, and our nervous system feels safe when we're in the presence of people that we, care about and who are kind and supportive to us. Spending time with our pets, they're very regulating and very calming, and they help us to feel safe. So, that's sometimes for some people, that's part of their wind down routine. Doing things that you find are fun, that's really important for our chemical regulation and helps us to switch again into that state of safety. We feel safe because we're enjoying ourselves. And spending time on yourself, this idea of self-care, not being selfish, this, carving out that half an hour or an hour before bed, just for you, letting everything else go and just thinking, this is my time. This is time for me to relax and to unwind and to do whatever it is that grounds me and nurtures me. That's really important. And if you have got, genuine trauma or, emotional distress in your life, that's going to be contributing to the stress in your nervous system and disrupted sleep. So if you need to seek out professional help and have some counseling or some therapy to help you with that. And it's interesting to note that this idea of cortisol and melatonin, they have a very close interrelationship. So melatonin suppresses the production of cortisol, which is one of the reasons why it helps us to fall asleep. But cortisol suppresses melatonin and keeps us awake. So if we have too much of one or the other of those chemicals in our system, it's going to, affect our sleep. So that's one of the reasons why stress is such a big factor in our sleep. So foods and drinks that can disrupt our sleep. We've mentioned, coffee, caffeine, alcohol. These have, stimulating chemicals in them that affect our circadian rhythm. So it really disrupts this lovely balance that we're trying to create. It disrupts our melatonin and other hormones and chemicals in our bodies that are, needed for sleep. Caffeine can stay in our blood for 6 to 8 hours. So if you do have some coffee, you need to make sure that that's well away from bedtime. Some people are not affected by it, but other people are very sensitive. So it's important to know whether that's you and to manage that. I've mentioned, blood sugar. We need stable blood sugar when we're going to bed at night. So we need to make sure that during the day we're eating complex carbs, healthy fats, healthy sources of protein to make sure that our glucose levels are stable and we're not tanking as we go to bed, because we don't want to run out of fuel halfway through the night. I've mentioned that large meals before bedtime can affect our digestion and keep us awake. And, I've mentioned there we don't want to be hungry when we go to bed and we, get the blood sugar drop. And histamine, high histamine foods. We definitely don't want to be eating those just before we go to bed, because that histamine in our brain and our nervous system will disrupt our sleep. So we all know the cheese, alcohol, cured aged meats, fermented foods, and fruits and vegetables that are high in histamine, like, tomatoes, avocados, strawberries, the things that produce histamine for us we need to be avoiding those, particularly before bed. And, you know, people talk about cheese and not eating cheese before bed. And that's, of course, that's why, because it's very high in histamine and it will disrupt your sleep. So I've mentioned there the timing of food, just to say we need to finish eating about 4 hours before we go to sleep so that our body has time to do all of its digestion and get rid of it all before we lie down. Because if we lie down on a big meal, we'll get indigestion and reflux, and obviously that disrupts our sleep. The digestion is happening in the night, so we can't do the functions that we need to do. And there's something called the migratory motor complex that happens in our digestive system at night, where, or it's basically like the housekeeping of our digestive system. In order to keep our gut healthy and well and functioning, we need an empty digestive system at night so that our body can do this cleansing process where it pushes everything out that shouldn't be there and gives it a good sweep through. And if our body is still digesting, that doesn't switch on. It only switches on when the last bits of food have been digested completely. So we need to have an empty digestive system to go to bed, and then our body can shut down that kind of the digestive part of our functions and use that energy to do the repair and detoxing work that it needs to do. So the timing of when we eat is really critical. And then there are things in food that help us to sleep. So tryptophan, which is the precursor to serotonin, and again helps to promote sleep. There are foods that contain tryptophan, and the best known of those is turkey, which is why we all have our Christmas dinner and then fall asleep in the afternoon, because we've had a huge dose of tryptophan, which has been converted to serotonin and makes us all sleepy. But other things, you know, their chicken also has it in, pumpkin seeds, milk, bananas. Foods contain magnesium, and we've talked about how magnesium is essential for helping our muscles and our nervous system to relax and to promote sleep. So nuts there, Brazil nuts, almonds, walnuts, pumpkin seeds, bananas again, and dark green leafy vegetables. Foods contain melatonin. We don't often think of that. We think, you know, that melatonin is produced in our brain, but actually tart cherries, grapes, pistachios, and bananas again, also nuts and oats, they have melatonin in. So we can eat melatonin and increase our levels of melatonin. GABA, again, that lovely calming neurotransmitter, again, is also in turkey and pork, certain seaweeds, tomatoes, shellfish, walnuts. L-theanine is an amino acid that helps our nervous system to be calm and regulated, and that's found in green and black tea, and that promotes relaxation. So this idea that when you've had a shock, you should have a nice cup of tea, that's actually quite true. It's quite helpful because it contains this lovely substance that helps our nervous system to calm. So interestingly there, you can see kiwi fruit contains serotonin and melatonin, and also a lot of antioxidants, and we need antioxidants to reduce inflammation, and inflammation interferes with our sleep. So kiwi fruits are a good choice to eat as a snack to help you to get to sleep. Bananas, as we've seen there, I know that a lot of people with MCAS don't tolerate bananas, but if you can, bananas have tryptophan, magnesium, melatonin. They've got all of these lovely substances in. So bananas and kiwi fruits are good options. Nuts are good options. Pumpkin seeds, you know, an oat biscuit would help you to sleep. Cherries are a good option, or a cup of tea. So if you're looking for anything like a bedtime snack, you don't want to eat too much, as we've said, you don't want a big meal before bed. But if you do want to eat something that helps you promote sleep, then those are good options in terms of food. And then there are drinks that can help to promote sleep. So chamomile tea, very well known. There's a lot of studies that show that it helps to calm our nervous system. Peppermint tea is another one that a lot of people find very relaxing. Valerian root is something that helps us to sleep. Nettle tea is a really good antihistamine, so that blocks the histamine levels. Passion flower as well is very strongly effective on our nervous system and calms our nervous system. Turmeric, people often drink turmeric in milk. That's very anti-inflammatory and has been shown in studies to help promote sleep. And as I said, tea as well. And people often talk about cocoa, have a cup of cocoa before bed. And actually, cocoa has got tryptophan in it. So it produces serotonin. It also contains magnesium and flavonoids as well, and antioxidants that help us, reduce inflammation. So there's a lot of good reason for drinking a cup of cocoa before bed. But cocoa does also contain caffeine and a substance called theobromine, and that can be stimulating. So some people are sensitive to that, and so they might, find that tricky. And obviously, a lot of us struggle with chocolate and cocoa with histamine as well. So this is all about finding what works for you, and it's a balance, and it's, about trial and error to find the things that your body can tolerate and that work best for you. But those are just some of the things that we can do to help our body. And it's really tough, I know, because when we're not sleeping and it's a chemical histamine MCAS reaction, it's really tough to get through that. And I think, there's no magic wand, that's just going to switch that off in a second. But there are strategies that we can implement, very small changes. And again, it's all about routine. So if we're doing these things regularly and we're consistently helping our body to have those signals for sleep, to have the right chemicals for sleep, to have the right foods for sleep, that all helps our bodies to sleep as well as they can. And over time, it can help regulate our bodies. So in summary, good sleep is really important for us. And there are certain foods and lifestyle habits that interfere with our sleep, but there are also foods and habits that can help promote healthy sleep. So thinking for you, think about what you can take away from this. What are the factors that could really disrupt your sleep? What do you think are the main ones for you? Are there any of those tips that you can implement that would help you with your sleep? And are there any foods that you can tolerate that might help you with your sleep? Those are the kind of questions that I would be thinking about. So those are my contact details. If anyone has got questions, I'm happy, for you to email me. I'm livewellwithchronicillness@outlook.com. And, you can find me on various different channels. And that's the end.